Good evening, everybody. We're going to make a start, and I'm absolutely delighted here to be chairing this session and really looking forward to what Joris is going to talk to us about. So anyway, just a little bit about Joris. So Joris is a pioneering trainer in anti-racism, bias and decoloniality. Draws his unique insights from both his lived experience as a marginalised individual, black, queer, neurodivergent, and his expertise in the sociology of the built environment. He has not only transformed countless lives through his training, but has also ignited a movement on social media. With a growing online community of engaged followers, Joris is a digital influencer who amplifies the message of equity and inclusivity to a global audience. His captivating journey, spanning 5 countries on 3 continents, has endowed him with a profound understanding of the intricate web of oppression, making him a powerful voice in the fight for equality, and never more needed than in our times, for sure. So Joris doesn't just teach change, he embodies it. Prepare to be inspired, educated, and moved as he guides us all this evening on a transformative journey towards a more inclusive world, both in person and across his thriving social media platforms. And just to reassure you that we will hopefully have time for some questions at the end, because as this is the last session, we can stay on a few minutes to do that and engage in the discussion at that point. So without further ado, I'd like you all to give welcome, a Céad Míle Fáilte, that's 100,000 welcomes, Irish welcome to Joris. There you go, Joris.
Thank you very much. That was a very impressive bio. Who was that about? No, that was a surprise. So, well, yeah, I appreciate. So thanks for being here today. I usually, when I address a crowd of neurodivergent people, I'm used to seeing more people knitting, people eating, people stimming. I don't see enough of that. Where are the knitters in the room? Anyway, if you feel called upon and if you feel that you need to do anything to feel more comfortable, feel absolutely free to do so. All right, so what I'm going to be talking about today is decolonizing and reindigenizing autism. So this title might be a surprise for you, and that's because I only came up with it a few hours ago. But this is, at the moment, my, let's say, my special interest. I've had special interest, decolonizing as a special interest for a couple of years now, but I am now ready to move to another stage, which is reindigenizing. So I will go into more details about what I mean, and more specifically, what does that mean in the context of autism. And to start with, because I'm all about embodying and lived experience, I'm going to start with my own lived experience, and I'm going to start talking about my mum. So a little thing about my mum. What about myself first? As you can tell, I am mixed race, so I am the product of different cultures, black culture, black Caribbean culture, white culture as well. And I've got most of my cultural identity from my mum. And my mum has always really struggled with Western society. My mum never really felt adapted to Western society, to the Western expectations. She always never really understood the obsession about money, hierarchies, extraction, and exploitation. So she never felt that she could really fit in a capitalist Western European society. And she taught me the importance of connecting to the land, to plants, to animals, to talking to plants, to the land, to places, to really have an affectionate a connection, an emotional connection to places, to inanimate objects. And she also taught me the importance of rituals and symbols. There was always a lot of rituals in her culture, in our culture as well, and we had specific words for specific things. When we were leaving a place, for instance, on holiday, when we were leaving a place, there was a ritual to say goodbye to the place. There were certain rituals that we were performing together. So a very strong emphasis on symbolism and on rituals. Now, one thing I forgot to mention about my mom is that this is my mom. That's me and my mom. She's white. My mom is not indigenous. She's not a black person. She's just autistic. So all of the specificities, the characteristics that I've just said, that are very often attributed to indigenous cultures, to black cultures or cultures that haven't completely lost their identity through colonization and invasion. This is also something that I, much later on in my life, was able to also connect to autism. And so this is the parallel between the autistic experience and the indigenous experience that I will be exploring, and more importantly, how those two experiences, and I'll be very careful to not imply that this is the same thing, because it's not, but we can use those commonalities and those parallels to hopefully find solutions to societal issues that we are all facing today as autistic people, but also as members of a capitalistic colonial society that we are a part of. So now, going back to myself, I am a trainer and educator, a big mouth, also due to my autism, but I didn't know that at the beginning, and now I just so happen to have met an audience and platforms that enable me to talk about what I want to say, talk about my special interests, and meet people who are also interested in the same things. So I got very lucky in that sense. I am black, I am queer. I have lived experience on both sides of marginalization and privilege, and I will be talking about that a little bit later as well, but I think it's very important for me to be aware of that. I also have ADHD, so I am ODHD. My experience of autism is that it's occasionally disabled, and in that aspect, I know that this is rather a privileged experience within the context of autism. I am hyperverbal. That's the reason why I'm on stage here with you today. That is not the case for many autistic people. So within the spectrum of autism, on top of my other marginalized identity, I do also acknowledge my privileges. For instance, I am on stage here, I'm fairly comfortable. The spotlights don't bother me too much. I am not too sensitive to the sound, so I am able to move through most spaces without being impeded. However, I nearly didn't make it today, and I nearly couldn't come to the stage today, and I nearly did not have a presentation for the reason that a few days ago I had a very big deadline, and I had to produce something to apply for an artistic residency, something that I had never done before. And the reason why I'm saying that is that it is one of the aspects of my autism that makes it so that I do not know how to communicate with institutions and with big organizations. I don't necessarily speak their language, and I really struggle to meet their requirements to understand what is expected of me and how to talk to someone who's not a human, but who represents an organization. And that I place it squarely within my neurodiversity, my autistic identity as well. This is one of the aspects of the struggles of autistic people. And because it was such, yes, it was a huge deadline that I missed. I missed the deadline by a few hours, and I'm sure that among you, missing deadlines is a common experience. But on top of that, the lack of understanding of what is expected of me, feeling like I don't speak the language, the same language as institutions, that is something that I experience as something lightly disabling. And on the topic of disability, I would say that my autism, the only times that I really feel disabled are when I am rushed, when I have deadlines, and at airports. Those are the only situations for me where I sometimes feel like I have to disclose my neurodivergence. And so I think that this is quite representative of the experience, and it has to do with the way that we fit into society. So I am not an academic. I work with academics, and I have trained university teachers on anti-racism, bias, privilege, decoloniality. I have published with academics, with sociologists. My colleagues, my work partners are sociologists, but I am not an academic myself for reasons that I have just explained. And I am in a position right now where, even though I produce knowledge and I want to participate in society and in academia through the knowledge that I produce, I am not sure whether I will ever be able to go back into academia and have my contribution sanctioned by degrees, by a degree, by a PhD, or because of that difficulty of understanding and speaking the language of institutions. So this section is about romanticizing autism, because what I've just said was about my experience of autism, but I am fully aware, as I said, that within the context of autism, this is a fairly privileged experience, and I acknowledge that it is not the case for most of the autistic experience to be able to be on stage and to be sharing a keynote with you today. So what I'm about to do in this presentation is that I will be engaging is what could be described as romanticizing autism. And I will do that for a reason. I will do that because I will be presenting the autistic experience from an angle that challenges the deficit model of disability. By challenging that and by showing that autism is much more than not the absence of certain abilities and a deficit in communication, in connection, by showing that, I will be engaging in what could be interpreted as romanticizing autism. So that's why I'm being very clear, do not try this at home. I'm a trained professional. I deliver workshops in a specific context, so this is why I'm having all of this caveat here, but I'm fully aware that this, when taken out of context, could have negative consequences for people who are already systemically, whose voice is already systemically not as audible as people like me within the context of the autistic experience. So this is a philosophical exercise to add to your existing knowledge and experience of autism, not to erase it. So if whatever I say doesn't resonate with you, that's absolutely fine. If you don't find that useful, and if you don't find that as a relevant lens to understand your experience, that's absolutely okay. I'm not saying that my truth is the only truth. And some people experience autism as a severe disability. That is not my case. So I can only speak to my own experience. But so this is not to be taken out of context, and I hope that this is not used to ignore, minimize, or silence other experience of autism who do not have the luxury of presenting it in a way that could be quite enticing or inspiring. So what I've just done was acknowledging my positionality, acknowledging my privileges and my disadvantages. And this is something that I wish more people would do whenever we enter conversations around identity, around systems of oppression, around inequality. And I'm sure that as autistic people, this is something that you get to do quite often. So it's very important to acknowledge our disadvantages, but also our privileges. We all have our own set of privileges and disadvantages, all of us. And we all participate in systems of oppression, even the ones that we are aware of and we work to dismantle, and more importantly, the ones that we're not even aware of. So this is not about pointing fingers, and this is not about guilt or making anyone feel bad about being white, because that will come up later, about being Westerners. But this is really about acknowledging that we all have our own sets of privileges and disadvantages. And also privileges invisible, mostly invisible to those who have it. So your disadvantages, the reason why you're here is probably because you are autistic, you are neurodivergent, and this is something that you're acutely aware when that experience represents a hurdle in your life, when that experience isolates you or represents an extra struggle. in the situations when it doesn't, then you are not constantly reminded by society that this is part of your identity. Therefore, it's much easier to not be aware of it. This is why white people are much less likely to be aware of the ways that whiteness impacts their life than black people are aware of the ways that their blackness impacts their life. It's simply because the absence of a struggle is very difficult to identify unless somebody tells you about that struggle. So that was positionality, and I've just also practiced intersectionality. So intersectionality is the understanding that we all carry multiple identities at the same time, and that the intersection of those identities create a unique set of experiences and circumstances. So most of the people in this room are probably autistic. However, on top of that autism, we still carry with us our gender identity, our sexual orientation, our racialization, all of those identities which also impact our experience of autism. And even when sometimes it's not really, it can be uncomfortable to acknowledge that they impact our experience, but they are here at all times. None of you, when you walked into this room, left outside of the room any aspect of your identity. However, there are certain contexts in which they might impact you more than others, but you are still always the same combination of identities. So now let's go into the connection between autism and coloniality. I will explain what I mean by coloniality. This might be a new term for most of you because this is a term that most of the public is not usually familiar with. So don't worry, I will explain that. But first, just the next few slides will be based on an article that I wrote that was published last year in the Psychologist in the UK, and that was titled Decolonising Autism. And in that article, I came up with 3 assumptions that I believe are directly inherited from the colonial mindset, but that impact the way that autism is being studied, is being researched on, and is being talked about. So you will see. Those 3 colonial mindset assumptions are that what is invisible to the colonizer is non-existent to the colonizer. So what the colonizer doesn't see, they just assume that it doesn't exist. What is incomprehensible to the colonizer is deficient, is assumed to be deficient. And what seems different is assumed to be inferior or wrong to the colonizer. This is the way that the colonizers perceived indigenous people, indigenous populations, when they crossed the oceans and found justifications to enslave and exploit and dehumanize indigenous populations. But I'm sure that you can already see the parallel with the way that autistic people have been perceived and talked about. The assumption that because the general public, allistic, neurotypical people don't perceive the way that we communicate or don't understand it, it is assumed to be deficient. It is assumed that there's something wrong with the way that we feel things, the way that we communicate, the way that we empathize. And whereas, so that was all of those assumptions. Now, thankfully, science is evolving, but we still see horrible things being said about autistic people, studies that are being done without autistic people that do not center the autistic experience and that still have a very colonial approach of observing the subject, of studying a subject without giving them agency over the way that they are being studied and without giving them the possibility to really participate in the knowledge that is being produced about them. All of that are colonial approaches that initially came from the science of ethnography and also sociology. They have a big part of I would say, responsibility for this way of approaching other experiences, but also medicine, psychology, psychiatry, all of those disciplines, they have a huge, very heavy history of dehumanizing the subjects that they study. So this is how I place autism in the context of the colonial mindset. The same set of assumptions still underlies the understanding of autism and autism research to this day, even though a lot of progress have been made, but there are still some, whenever I see some recent studies and research, there are still some stuff that I really wonder why did that happen? Why was that allowed to happen? So now the difference between coloniality and colonization, because you might be wondering, I'm talking about decolonizing, but when I'm talking about decolonizing here, I don't mean decolonizing as in removing the colonization, because that is most of the countries on this planet have been supposedly decolonized. They have gained their independence, and the colonizer has left the governments of most of the places in the world. When we talk about the British Empire, for instance, it has been mostly dissolved, mostly. Saying that in Ireland is not innocent. But when I talk about coloniality, it's everything that still exists and that remains. It's the mindset, it's the structures that still favor the West and white supremacy, but Western countries and Western empires that even after the independence of most of the former colonies in the world, we still exist in a world that is based on extraction of resources, human and material, that is based on accumulation of wealth and capital in the West and in dominant countries, and in also the imposition of a certain way of being, of forming society, of knowing, of producing knowledge that is all Western-centered, and that always benefits whiteness and white supremacy and Eurocentrism and Western countries. So even though most countries have been decolonized, as in they got out of colonization, we still live in the system of coloniality. So when I talk about decolonizing from this point on, I do not mean just removing the colonial power, military power, even though there are still places on earth that are under that military colonial occupation. But I'm talking about decolonizing as in getting out of coloniality, which is a whole system of thinking, of perceiving the world, of approaching the other, but also approaching the self, alienating the self, separating the self from the other, from the land. Marx was talking about alienation. That also, in the context of coloniality, this is what coloniality does. It alienates, it separates, it dehumanizes. So what does decolonizing autism mean in this context? In the context that coloniality creates power imbalance, that would be autistic people as member of a marginalized group exists in a supremacist society. And people's experience in discrimination and oppression, we as autistic people, we experience it still. We experience discrimination and oppression from the hegemony of neuronormativity, from holistic, and also from systems and institutions that just were not thought and built with people like us in mind. Epistemological violence, that goes back to the research, the autistic research that I mentioned earlier. Still terrible things are being said and done about autistic people in the name of science, in the name of research. So to decolonize autism, that would mean working towards giving agency to the autistic people and the autistic community, centering discourses, research, and knowledge around the autistic lived experience, and recognizing it as a valid form of expertise that would contribute to redress the harm caused by epistemological violence. So centering the lived experience, this is a very decolonial approach. The idea that marginalized people have expertise in their own lived experience, even if it's not necessarily recognized by institutions, by science, and by academia. And the assumed universality and apolitical character of being in society, that's another thing that coloniality does. So this idea that there's a default, and when you belong to the default group, you are apolitical, you are neutral, you are objective, and it's only people who exist outside of that default that suddenly are perceived as being political, as being challenging the system just by existing, and by not being neutral and not being capable of having an objective experience, because their experience is associated with emotions, with all of those gooey things that we don't do in Western science. So our existence, knowledge, and perception as autistic people of the world are informed by our positionality, the thing that I talked about earlier. Dominant discourses and practices reflect the implicit biases of society and reinforce normative, supremacist assumptions. Existing inside or outside of the norm is inherently political in both cases, whether we are inside the norm or outside the norm. But of course, when we live inside the norm, we don't realize that the norm even exists, because we are not reminded by society constantly that this is an effort that we have to produce. And social construct of gender, race, class, disability, sexuality, etc., existing as an autistic person already gives us the experience of being outside of the norm and the normativity and the rules, feeling outside of it. So understanding the socially constructed nature of norms and conventions is crucial to understanding the ways in which autistic people may be affected and be failed by those systems, and how to remedy it. So that was the busiest slide. The rest I'm going to be talking more. There will be less to read. Don't worry about it. So I've talked about decolonizing autism and the things that coloniality does. It doesn't do it only to autistic people, of course. The exercise that I'm doing here is precisely to take something that is usually understood as completely unrelated to neurodivergence and autism, but I'm placing those two things together, and I'm looking at how they interact and how this is a valid lens to also understand autistic struggle, autistic experience, but also think about autistic liberation. So we've seen the way that coloniality, in many ways, were affecting the autistic experience as a system of oppression, of domination, of extraction, of dehumanization. Now, the opposite of coloniality is indigeneity. So now that we've talked about decolonizing autism, which is what I talked mostly about in the article that I mentioned that I published last year, now it's about reindigenizing it, the next step, the more exciting and more inspiring step, I believe, in my opinion. So indigeneity and coloniality are mutually constructed. They both exist. If the colonizers didn't arrive in North America, the people there would not be indigenous, they would just be people existing, minding their business. They became indigenous when coloniality arrived in the bodies of the colonizers. So what is indigeneity? It's every behavior, practice, way of existing, way of connecting that exists outside or in defiance to coloniality. All of those are indigenous. So when we talk about indigenous peoples, they could be completely unrelated. They can have completely different ways of being. And there's also maybe the temptation to idealize indigenous societies. This is not what I'm doing here. Violence is also part of indigenous societies, injustice, all of that. But in this context, we call indigenous everything that exists in opposition as a result and or outside of coloniality. So it's a way of practicing relationships with the land, with the other, and with life in general that isn't based on domination and extraction. Domination and extraction, this is what coloniality does in the form of, you can name patriarchism, I forgot the term, but the patriarchy, racism, capitalism, all of those systems, they are the product in this context of coloniality. And so indigeneity is creating relationship and defining yourself in the relationship that you have and the equilibrium in which you exist in your environment, rather than in your position of power and in your ability to extract, to dominate, and to rule. And so I've already mentioned relationality. That is one of the key points and key definition of indigeneity. So it's existing on a focus on relationality. Relationality is a framework of indigenous knowledges and practices and responsibilities with kin. It shifts the paradigm from defending our place in society in terms of hierarchy and power structures to defining our identities through how we are related to everybody and everything around us in our past, in the present, and in the future. So there's also such a thing as indigenous temporality, which doesn't necessarily divide time in past, present, future, like Eurocentric cultures tend to do. So that definition of relationality, that's from Lauren Tynan, a indigenous woman from Tasmania. So now that we've gone through coloniality, indigeneity, and relationality, can you think of a way of being that is defined by very strong connections to things that aren't seen as worthy of connection by the Western monoculture? There's indigeneity. Those are indigenous traits. But can you think of another identity and way of being that would also be defined by that? Can you think of a other identity that is a different way of relating and communicating with other people, of perceiving the self? Can you think of another way of being that is also defined by a sensory experience that is more adapted to natural, non-industrialized environment and textures? And can you think of an experience of time that isn't tuned to the social expectations and social productivist imperatives of a capitalist society? So we have indigeneity and we have autism. That's the tism, all of those things that also is a valid way of defining or talking about autism. So when we talk about reindigenizing autism, this is what I mean. Placing it in a context where indigeneity, or the existence outside of oppressive structures of coloniality, that applies to indigenous being, that also applies to autistic people, even though autistic people also can and do participate in coloniality and other forms of oppressive systems. So since autism is pathologized by coloniality, perhaps the autistic experience can also inform our efforts to decolonize and re-indigenize our societies. So a few more caveats, because again, I'm professionally trained to do this, so be careful. A few things to think about. Be aware of ASPE supremacy, because what I've just talked about are ways of presenting autism in a positive light and in a light that goes against the idea that autism, the autistic experience, is the absence of abilities. However, there is also a current of belief that is ASPE supremacy that presents autism as a superior way of being. And even though I can understand that in the context of having been oppressed and being told your entire life that because you're autistic you were lesser than, it's an understandable reaction and response to think, well, actually, no, I'm not lesser than, I am better than. It's an understandable reaction, but it's a dangerous one that we need to be aware of and that we need to not fall into. So all of the positive ways that I've presented autism right now, they have to be also not be taken out of context and put into a context of supremacy, because all forms of supremacy, all supremacist discourses are colonial in essence. So any idea that places a certain group of people, a certain way of being, as superior, as better, as the truth, that is coloniality already. Because indigeneity says that life, in order to exist and to be rich and plentiful and abundant, has to be multiple. There are multiple valid ways of being, and we need diversity to exist. That's the indigenous conception of life in general. It is based on the wealth comes from the diversity. As soon as we start believing in supremacy, in superiority, in one truth above others, then we are already participating in the colonial mindset that leads to coloniality. Another thing to keep in mind, after having said all this, is that autism can still be experienced as an obstacle to creating indigenous relationality. Because again, I have romanticized it as we have a natural connection to animals, to plants, to places, to other people. But there are still ways in which being autistic may feel isolated, may be an obstacle to really connecting to others, to the land, to nature. I myself, despite my politics, which are very collectivist, and I want further integration, I want to move away from a very individualistic society. Those are my politics. However, my autism very often prevents me from living according to my policies. And yes, I still live by myself. I still would find it very difficult to live in a commune. When I am in Guadeloupe in the Caribbean, which is a culture of hitchhiking, and it's very common to take a hitchhiker and to help out, to be part of a community, I don't do that. So just because we're autistic doesn't mean that we automatically, magically are integrated in nature. So I want to make that point, even though our neurotype might make it more likely that it is the case, but it's not always the case, and that's okay. And last point, most of what I've done here and the idea of decoloniality, it approaches colonization as a metaphor, which I argue is valid, especially when we look at the mindset that has enabled colonization and the colonial mindset. I think that is very important to look at it from a non-material way. However, there are still places in the world where colonization is still an active, physical effort and movement that physically colonizes the space, and we cannot talk about decoloniality or decolonization if we don't consider that in settler colonies, then the colonizer there has to be a removal of the system and the structure that implements colonization. So there is an entire movement in decoloniality that affirms that decolonization is not a metaphor. I think that this more specifically applies to settler colonies, not necessarily in places like Europe or Ireland. I think that in Ireland you've done the job mostly of removing the colonizer, so decolonization now can be more of a metaphor. But so that's the three caveats that I would put to what I've just said. And now I will talk about the autistic experiences outside of coloniality, because as I've said, in many ways, we can approach autism as an experience that is already in defiance or exists outside of the imperatives of capitalism, of colonization. So we can see now how the autistic traits, they can also exist and be a challenge to those systems of oppression. So for instance, if we look at the way that autistic people exist outside of coloniality in potentially indigenous societies, we can see that in many indigenous societies, the social function of people who are connected, who have a gift to be able to speak either to the ancestors, to the spirits, who have access to trance, to getting in trance and in states of trance, those people in most indigenous societies, they have a role, they have a name, they are respected, they are admired, they have a place in society. In the Western context, it's just weird people, crazy people, disabled people, people who are just perceived as how can we manage them, how can we make sure that they're not a danger, and how can we, if they are not able to be productive, what are going to do with them? This is the way that coloniality and Western capitalism approaches that. But if we look at many indigenous or all indigenous societies, and probably European societies before capitalism, before industrializations, there was a role for people who were a little bit different, who felt connected or who were perceived to be connected to the other world and ancestrality. So in indigenous societies, the social status, when there is not the pressure of coloniality, of capitalism, of productivism, of industrialization, then social status are determined by things that are not directly related to your ability to produce or to accumulate wealth, but it can be also determined by the way that you're able to contribute, the gift that you have. So in this context, autistic people are more likely in a society like that to feel like they are integrated and they have a place. Historically, that has been the case. In indigenous societies, social norms that are built around naturally occurring events, naturally occurring places, cycles, those are places where autistic people are more likely to thrive and to find their place and to find a role, because we are not the best at productivity, at doing capitalism, even though sometimes autism can be an excellent, sadly, a very useful tool for capitalism. But in the context of indigenous civilizations, that can be perceived as differently. And the autistic experience may be less isolating and odd. And yeah, the other way that autism is impacted by existing in indigenous societies is those societies tend to have a collectively shared cosmology where everybody agrees on the way that the world works, the world appeared, and where the world is going. And because there tends to be a much more unified cosmology around that, it provides meaning. And I'm sure that as autistic people, you are well aware that if something doesn't make sense, it really bothers us. And we find it very difficult to accept things the way they are, even though we don't have a choice. And in a society where there is already a story, and it's not about the story being true or wrong, but when the society that you exist in already has a story and is able to provide meaning, then the experience of autism might be much less disabling for the people for autistic people. So that brings the question. Now that we see the ways in which it is possible that autism might be affected by the different ways in which it can manifest itself and be experienced in indigenous societies, that brings the questions, is there even such a thing as autism in indigenous societies? This is a question. Is it socially constructed as a pathology, as a disability in other societies that exist outside of the Western colonial norm? Those are questions that I would love to know a little bit more about, but unfortunately, there's not much research and knowledge around that, and we'll see that in the next slide. Or is it just perceived as disjointed sets of personality traits, like being shy, turning around in your sleep, and not liking pineapples? In our society, those are completely unrelated things, but perhaps what we define as autistic traits in other societies makes equally no sense to put together. It makes sense here because it is associated to a certain inability to participate in society, and we have put the name autism on that. We have labeled it as autism and we have pathologized it in the West. But in other societies where those traits might not be as visible, as prevalent, or as determining of your identity and your experience, then what becomes of the label autism? Is there still an autism, or do we call it differently, or does it cease to exist? So what is the prevalence of sensory sensitivity, for instance, when people are raised in nature? What happens to people who have difficulties with specific textures, with specific tastes, who have eating disorders? What happens to them in indigenous societies? Do they also exist? And in which case, how do they cope with it? Do they find accommodation? Is it less likely to happen? We know, for instance, that there are much more people in the United States who are gluten intolerant. And when they travel to Europe and they go to France and to Italy, suddenly they find themselves able to eat bread, suddenly for the first time in their lives. And so this is the way that the society that we exist in and the way that it produces things can affect our experience. So does that mean that they're suddenly no longer gluten intolerant? Well, depending on where they are, they may be and they may not be. So what does that look like when we apply that to autism? And I just said I would love to know more about that, but as far as I'm aware, we don't know. We don't have enough studies around that. We don't have enough people who spend their time putting autism and the autistic experience in the context of other non-Western centric societies. And I would love to know more about that. And that's a problem for me, that there's this lack of knowledge. Exclusively approaching autism from the angles of neuroscience and psychiatry, which has historically been the fields that look into autism and try to understand autism and produce knowledge around autism, that can only perpetuate colonial assumptions and the deficit model of disability. So to be clear, I'm not saying that neuroscience and psychiatry should stop looking and studying autism, but other disciplines should be looking into it as well. To shift the paradigm, we need to start approaching autism from a sociology perspective, from an anthropological perspective as well. And I don't see enough of that happening. In order to break out from the Western-centric understanding of autism, we need to have a multiplicity of approaches. And I fail to understand how autism, which is defined by a difference in the way that we communicate, in the way that we relate to others, something that is so deeply entrenched in the way that we socialize, how is it not more approached from a sociological perspective, from a more human perspective? This is a big frustration, and I wanted to use this opportunity. I think that some of you here are involved in research, on autism research. You are part of academia, and so I really hope that I can give the message to you that we need to approach autism from a multiplicity of angles and kind of break the boundaries, and the boundaries of disciplines, the boundaries of neuroscience and psychiatry and psychology. Those are very important, but there's more approaches that need to be taken. And yeah, this was my conclusion. So just a few more things. Those are my social media, because that's where I'm the most active. I am not yet part of academia, maybe one day, but I find it difficult. So in the meantime, this is where you will find my knowledge, mostly. And yeah, now I think we have time. We have 13, 14 minutes for questions, but I will, yeah. Thank you.
Garav Mila Mahaga, Joris. So in Irish, that means 1,000 thank yous. And I think certainly in Ireland, we related to your analysis in relation to, let me get the word right now, coloniality, because it's a word I didn't know until now. And I am in academia, so I just want to thank you for challenging our thinking and for provoking a lot of those beliefs that we have, because unless we keep questioning our beliefs, we're actually going nowhere. We're going to be stopped. And I just finished a book on 100 years of special education in Ireland, and so it was 100 years in from 1922, because that's when we got our independence. So a lot of what you said actually resonated with me in terms of that colonial mindset and that impact on the way we see difference, actually. And we in Ireland, in our culture, we used to refer to those who are different as dina or lag dia love, and that means a person on whom God has placed the hand. So I think there is so much for us to explore, and thank you for stimulating our thinking. Now I'm going to stop talking, but I'm sure we have some questions. So I think we have some roving microphones in the hall, or if we don't,
Hello.
just shout and we will hear.
Can you hear me okay?
Perfectly.
Hi, my name is Michael. I'm from Cardiff University. I teach architecture there, and I teach a design unit in the third year, which is focused on autism and its interrelation with architecture and with place. I think I just want to say thanks, first of all, for a really interesting presentation. Yeah, it was super. I think, you know, it was a new way of thinking about a subject, and I think that's what was brilliant about it. I'd never thought about autism in that way before. I also have a child who's autistic, who's 6 years old currently, Rudy. So I'm invested in this in many ways, this particular topic. I was wondering, it was interesting, the chair there mentioned about a translation into Irish. And what we did with my design unit last year is one of the students was looking at translations for the word autism into different languages. And so what she noticed was a kind of commonality, actually, in many different languages, such as Arabic, for example, and maybe there are people in the room that can talk more about this than I can. But those words were translated as daydreamer, inward-looking, and so in that limited experience, there did seem to be a common language to describe people who were autistic. And I mean, I'm trying to think about your description of this, and then wondering whether that kind of colonial mindset is then cross-cultural, or is it a colonial mindset, or it's a way of describing otherness? But I wondered whether that might be an area where you could investigate this more, because I am very interested to understand whether in different indigenous cultures there is more of a kind of acceptance because of these different kinds of Western conditions that might be absent in those kinds of situations. But yeah, I just wanted to say thanks again for a lovely talk. Thank you. It'd be great to get you to Cardiff, actually, to speak to our students. So let's talk about that as well.
Well, yes, please do get in touch, because usually most of the content that I make on social media is around the sociology of the built environment. So yeah, architecture, that's actually my actual background is in architecture. I just fell into sociology through a convoluted path, but that's very interesting, and thank you for your comment. There's the term in Maori, and I wish I knew that this would come up. But the term for autism in Maori, I forgot the specific word, but I know that it means in one's own time and space. And that is also a very interesting way of approaching autism. We ended up, unsurprisingly, being in the West, but we ended up with the most I would say, mute term. Autism doesn't evoke anything other than the pathologizing experience, but it doesn't say anything. There's no image attached to the word autism. In other languages, I was not aware of the Arabic term for autism, which is, are you showing me, is it the term that, yeah, if you...
Yeah, daydreamer, I think was, or you're...
Takiwatanga in Maori. I hope I'm saying it more or less correctly. But yeah, so it's very interesting to see the same term in different languages, because yes, there is a place, even though there are completely different ways of approaching that experience, but there is a sense that something is different, but there is a place for that. And there's a place for us in every society, including the indigenous ones. And another point slightly connected to your comment is that there's very often the idea that indigeneity is stuck in the past. It's other old civilizations that have been destroyed by coloniality. But with the example of Maori, for instance, the term, it's a very recent creation. It has, I think it was created in the 2000 or 2010. So this just shows that indigeneity is still capable of producing concepts, producing terms, and it's still there. It survives despite coloniality.
Just one thing, I just wanted to add to what you just said there. So just talking about the translation of the word autism in different languages. So from where I come from in India, the word translates, and it's, again, the interpretation of the word, I suppose, because it can be interpreted in two ways. One is that to be so self-absorbed, which is horrendous if you think about it. But the other, but the other interpretation of the same word is to live in a world created by themselves. So one can be very accommodating, whereas the other can be very horribly dissociating you from the rest of the world, I suppose. Right. But like you said, it comes down to the indigeneity of the word itself and the society you're living in. But I feel like this word has become almost lost in the language itself, because even, I would say, people who know Hindi would not be familiar with it because its roots are almost tied to Sanskrit in certain ways, which again is a language that's slowly, I don't want to say dying. It's, if even one person speaks it, it's still there. But I just thought I'll add to what you were just saying there, just for reference with the Maori language as well. So thank you for that, sorry.
Thank you very much. Yes, and yeah, it's important to also remember that the West and Western coloniality, because when I talk about coloniality, I'm specifically talking about the Western coloniality. It has the unique feature that it has managed to impose itself to the entire world. So when we talk about indigenous civilizations and peoples, we're not saying that they did not engage in things that could be also described as colonization, as violence, epistemic violence, etc. That has always existed, but what makes it unique about European Western coloniality is that it has succeeded in imposing itself all over the world. And so as a result, there are languages that are dying, that are other ways, completely valid ways of describing universal experiences that are being lost in translation, that are being lost by the imposition of coloniality.
Hi, I'm Dr. Hingston. I come from the land of treaties 5 and 6 in Western Canada. I am of Irish settler descent, and feel very completely disconnected from my own Irish ethnic roots. But I wanted to share some of the research that's going on in Western Canada by Indigenous people. The Cree term, people of Treaty 5, for autism is Pitoteyatam, which translates to he or she thinks differently. And this is being brought into scholarship by Dr. Grant Bruno. Can I read something from him?
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean,
so
we have time.
Dr. Grant Bruno is working to bridge the divide between traditional Western approaches to people living with autism and a holistic knowledge based on Indigenous knowledge. He explains that Western medical definitions are very rooted in these ableist colonial perspectives. And his idea, he says that this idea, he believes it's rooted back into the church, was that being disabled was a sin. If you're a sin, then you weren't supposed to be able to be part of the society. And that's something I see in the community, unfortunately, because residential schools brought those beliefs into our community, he says. And to move past those perspectives, he's worked with elders in Treaty 6 territory to understand how it would be traditionally viewed in his Indigenous communities outside the Western influence. And the overall consensus is that we would have viewed it as a gift, as something to be celebrated. And what his work is to take the knowledge I've been gifted through these elders and to share the knowledge back to community and say, hey, we would have practiced full acceptance, and we should get back to that.
Thank you for sharing that. Could you send me all of those later? Yeah. Is that part of one of your workshops as well? Or okay, well, well done.
Hello. Thank you for your presentation. My name is Jawahir. I'm from the United Arab Emirates. I have a few points, but I won't take long. I'm autistic myself. I'm late diagnosed, and I honestly feel like your whole presentation was very validating, and the way I saw the world anyway. So it's not really a surprise for me. I also come from the mountain, from back in my country, and I feel like the way I am is just more, as you say, connected to nature and have that like more spiritual way of seeing things. And so that I do agree with that also. not to say that neurotypicals are not spiritual, it's just, I feel like that's just very common. Like also the thing about not enough research is being done from the anthropological or sociological point of view. From my own lived experience, whenever I leave the city life and, for example, travel to places like Bali and similar places, I just feel like all my autism so-called symptoms just disappear. Whatever stimming I have to do in the city, or adjusting and, all the drill. So it's true, like when you're in a more like natural environment where there's maybe more access to like healthier food and just spiritual practices, as known about Bali and elsewhere, you just feel like you're in the zone. You're very comfortable. Yeah, and all of this is actually being validated by very famous practitioners like Dr. Zach Bush. Like, if you're aware of him, he recently, in one of his speeches, he said, the world has so much to learn from autistic people because, again, he was like, they come to his clinic and he sees that they're just more connected to nature, and they're basically telling the world, let's just go back to a more natural way of living and away from so much overwhelm in a lot of ways. Yeah, and I recently, also one last thing, I wrote a song about neurodiversity. I would love to share it with you because it touches upon so many themes, like your mention of patriarchy and hierarchy and all of that. It's just a social activism, a song that really agrees with your message. Thank you.
Well, thank you, and please do send it over to me and with the translation if you would be very interested in listening to it. Thank you. I'm trying to go back to some of the points that you make about the idea that the world has so much to learn from autistic people. Yes, and not because we have the truth or that we have some superior knowledge or superior ability, but simply because of our diversity of perspective, because existing outside of the norms, that puts us at a vantage point to understand systems. And on top of that, our autistic traits, there's this belief that autistic people struggle with social cues, and, well, in many ways it is the case, but I'm talking about a belief because what would happen to that struggle if we were in an environment that makes social sense? Then when things start to make sense for autistic people, then suddenly it's much less disabling. And so, to build on this idea that the world has so much to learn from autistic people, the tragedy of that is that we are busy being marginalized, being silenced, being judged based on things that we will never be good at, and that completely bars us from accessing certain circles of knowledge, of power, where our contributions could be very, very useful. But in most of the times, we don't even get to that point because we are, as Einstein said, we are being judged. It's judged like judging a fish by its ability to climb a tree. Of course, then the fish will never have an opportunity to show what it's capable of. And I feel that very often for autistic people, that's pretty much the situation that we find ourselves in. We have so much to share, we have so much to contribute to society, but we are not able to because we are being judged on things that are not actually directly related to our ability to contribute. But that still places us as lesser than or incapable. And you mentioned also spirituality, and I think that at least in the West, it's probably quite likely that autistic people are more likely to be atheist or to not be active participant in a monotheist religion. But I believe that, but that has to be double checked, so don't take that for forgot how to say in English. But I think that what is interesting is that when we talk about connections, is that in the West, even religion has been almost removed from its purpose of connecting connecting to something, to a higher power, connecting to other people as well. All that has been kept and that is left of religion as we receive it, as we perceive it in the West, is its hierarchical structure, is the idea that there's someone that we're supposed to obey in the sky, and that we have to follow the rules. But everything that is related to connectedness, to connection, to relationality, that is also a very important part of religion, of all religions and all forms of spirituality. This is also something that we've lost in the West, and as a result, autistic people are probably even more likely to find themselves facing the concept of religion as something that doesn't make sense, because in the West we have removed the connection, the aspect of a religion, and for other societies that are not Western, that might be a completely different experience, and potentially autistic people are much more able to connect to a spirituality that still maintain that aspects of connection and connectedness.
We have one more question.
And
There's
2,
somebody
3.
signaling in
Thank
the back.
you. Yeah. Well, thank you very much. My name is Ignacio. I'm from Madrid, Spain. I will try to make sense of everything that's going on my head right now. But since the beginning of your talk, I've had in mind the work of Gloria Anzaldúa, which is, she's a Chicano feminist and lesbian writer. She talks about artistic expression and how having like an Aztec mask in a museum is invalid because it's supposed to be something of an artistic inside like a ritual, and that kind of performatic expression. And I was always I was like reflecting that most of our talks and most of our efforts are kind of making or trying to make knowledge in a scientific kind of epistemologic and phenomenologic way, no? And how could we go outside of that? Maybe coming back to those kind of alternative ways of creating knowledge based on rituals, based on something performatic. In a way, kind of, I would like to encourage you to maintain yourself outside of the academic, because maybe you could contribute very interestingly in that creation of a body of work by another thing, like maybe like social media, no? Which could give you like a scene of to create that aspect in a more performatic or ritualistic way. And my final question was, do you know if there's anything going on in that aspect, like people that would try to reflect knowledge of autism in that other kinds of way?
Well, thank you. Thank you for your question. So, unfortunately, no. I tried, knowing that I would be discussing this today, I tried to get in touch with autistic people or people who had knowledge of topics around psychology and psychiatry who also are indigenous. And I tried to ask them, what is your cultural understanding of autism, and what is what does autism look like in your own culture? I've had a few people responding and who are already making content about that. I'm thinking about Lovette Jallow, she is a Black Ghanaian and Swedish content creator as well. I'll give you the contact. But outside of that, I am not aware of many. Of course, there are more, but that I know of. Unfortunately, this is really something that I am missing as well. I am hungry for that knowledge and for that perspective, and there is not enough. I have struggled to find it, but hopefully this is something that will start emerging. And we have to rely on academia, even though, you know, we already exist outside of it. But unfortunately, with all of the shortcomings and the colonized ways that academia exists and operates, it is still a powerful tool of knowledge production. So when we can change it from the inside, and when we can put it in a direction that creates, that is more inclusive, I think that is still very the most efficient tool that we have. And to go back to what you said about, yes, thank you for bringing up the topic of knowledge production, because I think that both indigenous knowledge production and autistic knowledge production, they face similar challenges. There's one, that's not the main one, but that's the only one that comes to mind right now, so I'll start with the small one, which is the idea of individual knowledge production, individual author. So Western knowledge and Western academia is based on this idea that a concept, an idea, is attributed to one single person. Now, what happens to indigenous knowledge, to ancestral knowledge, to collective knowledge? We don't know what to do with it. And very often, unfortunately, Western science uses that gray area to steal indigenous knowledge, because we cannot trace it to a specific person, to a specific author. So, oh, well, it's ours to take. And very often we see that in different fields of science, in pharmacy, in chemistry, with plants, with many, many things. Knowledge ends up not being attributed to their rightful creators, because it's not a single person, it's not attributable to a single person, therefore we do whatever we want. And we, even in the context of autism and neurodivergence, there's a similar controversy around the term, the invention of neurodivergence and neurodiversity, because neurodiversity is typically attributed to Judy Singer, Australian white woman, but there are people within the autistic community who are challenging this idea that it's this one woman who invented the term neurodiversity, and they were able to show that this was a term that was already floating around in on the internet, in discussion forums, on boards, etc. So it's also, even Western knowledge, or knowledge that comes from the West, attributing it to one single person, that is not something that is really, that fits all situations, and that ends up really putting marginalized identities, marginalized people, marginalized societies, not being able to benefit from having created something because of that. So that was one thing. Oh, and yes, and the other thing is that this idea that knowledge exists in a vacuum, that has to be separated from the knowledge producer or from the subject, that is also very Western and very colonial. This separation between the ontological and the epistemic, what I know and the way I am, this is completely Western, and that does not apply to most knowledge and most indigenous knowledge. And it's only, I can say that the concept of ontological, I'm beginning to grasp what it means, but it's only been a few months. And now I know why. It's not that I'm dumb, but I don't understand the definitions, because I've had people telling me exactly what it means, but it just didn't make sense in the context of my life. And something that I like to say is that autistic people feel with their thoughts and think with their emotions. And so this separation between emotion and knowledge and intelligence doesn't make sense in an indigenous context, and for the same reason doesn't make sense, I believe, in an autistic context. So those are two things, again, in which getting out of the paradigm of coloniality benefits all of us, especially autistic and indigenous people. Thank you.
I know that someone here needs to go to a barbecue, maybe? No, I just want, again, to thank you so much for such an inspirational evening, and just, again, for making us all think about what we do and how we can work together to make this a better world. So thank you all so much, and have a lovely evening.